Good evening again, and welcome back for now the second part of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, as found amongst the papers of the late Deirdre Knickerbocker by Washington Irving. We had just met Brom Bones. This rantable hero had for some time singled out the blooming Katrina for the object of his uncouth gallantries, and though his amorous toyings were something more like the gentle caresses and endearments of a bear, yet it was whispered that she did not altogether discourage his hopes. Certain it is, his advances were signals for rival candidates to retire who felt no inclination to cross a line in his amours, insomuch that when his horse was seen tied to Van Tassel's paling on a Sunday night, a sure sign that his master was courting, or, as it is termed, sparking within, all other suitors passed by in despair and carried their war into other quarters. Such was the formidable rival whom Ichabod Crane had to contend. And considering all things, a stouter man than he would have shrunk from the competition, and a wiser man would have despaired. He had, however, a happy mixture of pliability and perseverance in his nature. He was in form and in spirit like a supple jack, yielding but tough. Though he bent, he never broke, and though he bowed beneath the slightest pressure, yet the moment it was away, jerk, he was erect and carried his head as high as ever. To have taken the field openly against his rival would have been madness, for he was not a man to be thwarted in his amours any more than that stormy lover Achilles. No, Ichabod, therefore, made his advances in a quiet and gently insinuating manner. Under cover of his character of singing master, he made frequent visits at the farmhouse, not that he had anything to apprehend from the meddlesome interference of parents, which is so often a stumbling block in the path of love. Now, Balt Van Tassel was an easy and indulgent soul. He loved his daughter, and better even than his pipe, and like a reasonable man and an excellent father, let her have her way in everything. His notable little wife, too, had enough to do to attend to her homekeeping and to manage the poultry, for, as she sagely observed, ducks and geese are foolish things and must be looked after. But girls can take care of themselves. Thus, while the busy dame bustled about the house or plied her spinning wheel at one end of the piazza, honest Balt Van Tassel would sit smoking his evening pipe at the other, watching the achievements of a little wooden warrior who, armed with a sword in each hand, was most valiantly fighting the wind on the pinnacle of the barn. In the meantime, Ichabod would carry on his suit with the daughter by the side of the spring under the great elm, or sauntering along in the twilight, that hour so favorable to a lover's eloquence. I profess not to know how women's hearts are wooed or won. To me, they have always been masters of riddle and admiration. Some seem to have but one vulnerable point or door of access, but while other hearts have 1,000 avenues and may be captured in 1,000 different ways. It is a great triumph of skill to gain the former, but still a greater proof of generalship to manage to maintain possession of the latter. For a man must battle for his fortress at every door and window, as they say. He who wins 1,000 common hearts is therefore entitled to some renown. But he who keeps undisputed sway over the heart of a coquette, well, is indeed a hero. Certain it is, this was not the case with the redoubtable Brom Bones. And from the moment Ichabod Crane made his advances, the interests of the former evidently declined. His horse was no longer seen tied at the palings on Sunday nights, and a deadly feud gradually arose between him and the preceptor of Sleepy Hollow. Brom, who had a degree of a rough chivalry in his nature, would fain have carried matters to open warfare, and have settled their pretensions to the lady, according to the mode of those most concise and simple reasoners, the knights-errant of yore, by single combat. But Ichabod was too conscious of the superior might of his adversary to enter into lists against him. He had overheard a boast of Bones, that he would double the schoolmaster up and lay him on a shelf on his own schoolhouse, and he was too wary to give him an opportunity. There was something extremely provoking in this obstinately pacific system. It left Brom no alternative but to draw upon the funds of rustic waggery in his disposition and play off boorish practical jokes upon his rival. Ichabod became the object of whimsical persecution to Bones and his gang of rough riders. They harried his hitherto peaceful domains. They smoked out his singing school by stopping up the chimney. They broke into the schoolhouse one night in spite of its formidable fastenings of wit and window stakes, and they turned everything topsy-turvy. So that the poor schoolmaster began to think that all of the witches in the country must hold their meetings there. But what was still more annoying, Brom took all opportunities of turning him into ridicule in the presence of his mistress, and had a scoundrel dog whom he taught to whine in the most ludicrous manner, and introduced as a rival of Ichabod's to instruct her in psalmody. In this way, matters went on for some time without producing any material effect on the relative situation of the two contending powers. On a fine autumnal afternoon, Ichabod, in a pensive mood, sat enthroned on the lofty stool whence he usually watched all the concerns of his little literary realm. In his hand, he swayed a ferule, that scepter of despotic power, the birch of justice, reposed on 3 nails behind the throne, a constant terror to evildoers, while on the deck before him, on the desk, might be seen sundry contraband articles and prohibited weapons detected upon the persons of idle urchins, such as half-munched apples, pop-guns, whirligigs, fly-cages, and whole legions of rampant little paper gamecocks. Apparently, there had been some appalling act of justice recently inflicted, for his scholars were all busily intent upon their books, or slyly whispering behind them with one eye kept upon the master, and a kind of buzzing stillness reigned throughout the schoolroom. It was suddenly interrupted by the appearance of a man in a tow-cloth jacket and trousers, a round-crowned fragment of a hat, like the cap of Mercury, and mounted on the back of a ragged, wild, half-broken colt, which he managed with a rope by way of a halter. He came clattering up to the school door with an invitation to Ichabod to attend a merrymaking or a quilting frolic, to be held that evening at Mynheer Van Tassel's. And having delivered his message with that air of importance and effort at fine language which a servant is apt to display on petty embassies of the kind, he dashed then over the brook, and was seen scampering away up the hollow, full of the importance and hurry of his mission. All was now bustle and hubbub in the late quiet schoolroom. The scholars were hurried through lessons without stopping at trifles. Those who were nimble skipped over half with impunity, and those who were tardy had a smart application now and then of the rear to quicken their speed or to help them over a tall word. Books were flung aside without being put away on the shelves, inkstands were overturned, benches were thrown down, and the whole school was turned loose an hour before the usual time, bursting forth like a legion of young imps, yelping and racketing about the green in joy at their early emancipation. The gallant Ichabod now spent at least an extra half-hour at his toilette, brushing and furbishing up his best, and indeed his only suit of rusty black, and arranging his locks by a bit of broken looking-glass that hung upon the schoolhouse. That he might make his appearance before his mistress in the true style of a cavalier, he borrowed a horse from the farmer with whom he was domiciliated, a choleric old Dutchman of the name of Hans van Ripper, and thus, gallantly mounted, he issued forth like a knight-errant in quest of adventures. But it is meet that I should, in the true spirit of romantic story, give some account of the looks and equipment of my hero and his steed. The animal he bestrode was a broken-down plough horse that had outlived most everything but viciousness. He was gaunt and shagged, with a ewe neck and a head like a hammer. His rusty mane and tail were tangled and knotted with burrs. One eye had lost its pupil and was glaring and spectral, but the other had the gleam of genuine devil in it. Still, he must have had fire and metal in his day, if we may judge from the name he bore of Gunpowder. He had, in fact, been a favorite steed of his master, the choleric Van Ripper, who was a furious rider, and had infused very probably some of his own spirit into the animal, for, old and broken down as he looked, there was still more of the lurking devil in him than in any young filly in the country. Ichabod was a suitable figure for such a steed. He rode in short stirrups, which brought his knees nearly up to the pommel of the saddle. His sharp elbows stuck out like a grasshopper's. He carried his whip perpendicularly in his hand like a scepter, and as his horse jogged on, the motion of his arms was not unlike the flapping of a pair of wings. A small wool hat rested on the top of his nose, for his so scanty strip of forehead might be called, and the skirts on his black coat fluttered out almost to his horse's tail. Such was the appearance of Ichabod and his steed as they shambled out of the gate of Hans van Ripper, and it was altogether such an apparition as is seldom to be met with in the broad daylight. It was, as I said, a fine autumnal day. The sky was clear and serene, and nature wore that rich and golden livery which we always associate with the idea of abundance. The forests had put on their sober brown and yellow, while some trees of the tender kind had been nipped by the frosts into brilliant dyes of orange, purple, and scarlet. Streaming files of old ducks began to make their appearance high in the air. The bark of the squirrel might be heard from the groves of beech and hickory nuts, the pensive whistle of the quail at intervals from the neighboring stubble field. The small birds were taking their farewell banquets. In the fullness of their reverie, they fluttered and chirping and frolicking from bush to bush and tree to tree, capricious from the very profusion and variety around them. There was the honest cock-robin, the favorite game of stripling sportsmen, with its loud, querulous note, and the twittering blackbirds flying in sable clouds. Oh, and the golden-winged woodpecker with his crimson crest and his broad black gorget and his splendid plumages. Oh, and the cedar bird with its red-tipped wings and its yellow-tipped tail, and its little Montiero cap of feathers. Oh, and the blue jay, that noisy coxcomb in his gay light blue coat and white underclothes, screaming and chattering, bobbing and knotting and bowing and pretending to be on good terms with every songster in the grove. As Ichabod jogged slowly on his way, his eye, ever open to every symptom of culinary abundance, ranged with delight over the treasures of jolly autumn. On all sides he beheld a vast store of apples, some hanging in oppressive opulence on the trees, some gathered into baskets and barrels for market, others heaped up in rich piles for the cider press. Farther on he beheld great fields of corn, with its golden ears peeping from their leafy coverts and holding out the promise of cakes and hasty pudding. Oh, and the yellow pumpkins laying beneath them, turning up their fair round bellies to the sun and giving ample prospects of the most luxurious of pies. And anon He passed the fragrant buckwheat fields, breathing the odor of the beehive, and as he beheld them, soft anticipations stole over his mind of dainty slapjacks, and well buttered and well garnished with honey or treacle by the delicate little dimpled hands of Katrina Van Tassel. Thus, feeding his mind with many sweet thoughts and sugared suppositions, he journeyed along the sides of a range of hills which look out upon some of the goodliest scenes of the mighty Hudson River. The sun gradually wheeled his broad disk down into the west. The wide bosom of the Tappan Zee lay motionless and glassy, well, excepting that here and there a gentle undulation waved and prolonged the blue shadow of the distant mountain. A few amber clouds floated in the sky, without a breath of air to move them. The horizon was of a fine golden tint, changing gradually to a pure apple green, and from that into the deep blue of the mid-heaven. A slanting ray lingered on the woody crests of the precipice that overhung some parts of the river, giving greater depth to the dark gray and purple of their rocky sides. A sloop was loitering in the distance, dropping slowly down with the tide, her sail hanging uselessly against the mast. And as the reflection of the sky gleamed along the still water, it seemed as if the vessel were suspended in the air. It was towards evening that Ichabod arrived at the castle of the Heer Van Tassel, which he found already thronged with the pride and flower of the adjacent country. Old farmers, a spare and leathern-faced race in homespun coats and breeches and blue stockings and huge shoes and magnificent pewter buckles, and their brisk weathered little dames in close-crimped caps and long-waisted short gowns and homespun petticoats with scissors and pincushions and gay calico pockets hanging on the outside, and buxom lasses almost as antiquated as their mothers, excepting where a straw hat or a fine ribbon or perhaps a white frock gave symptoms of city innovation. And the sons in their short, square-skirted coats with rows of stupendous brass buttons, and their hair generally queued in the fashion of the times, especially if they could procure an eel skin for the purpose, it being esteemed throughout the country a potent nourisher and strengthener of the hair. Brom Bones, however, was the hero of the scene, having come to the gathering on his favorite steed, Daredevil, a creature like himself full of mettle and mischief, and which no one but himself could manage. He was, in fact, noted for preferring vicious animals given to all kinds of tricks, which kept the rider in constant risk of his neck, for he held that a tractable and well-broken horse is unworthy of a lad of spirit. Fain would I pause to dwell upon the world of charms that burst upon the enraptured gaze of my hero as he entered the state parlor of Van Tassel's mansion. Not those of the bevy of buxom lasses with their luxurious displays of red and white, but the ample charms of a genuine Dutch country tea table in the sumptuous time of autumn. Such heaped-up platters of cakes of various and almost indescribable kinds, known only to experienced Dutch housewives. There was the doughy donut, the tender oily cock, and the crisp and crumbling cruller, sweet cakes and short cakes, ginger cakes and honey cakes, and the whole family of cakes. And then there were apple pies, and peach pies, and pumpkin pies, besides slices of ham and smoked beef, and moreover delectable dishes of preserved plums and peaches and pears and quinces, not to mention broiled shad and roasted chicken, together with bowls of milk and cream, all mingled higgledy-piggledy, pretty much as I have enumerated them, with the motherly teapot, of course, sending up its clouds of vapor from the midst. Oh, heaven bless the mark. I want breath and time to discuss this banquet as it deserves, and I am too eager to get on with my story. Happily, Ichabod Crane was not in so great a hurry as his historian, but he did ample justice to every dainty. He was a kind and thankful creature, whose heart dilated in proportion as his skin was filled with good cheer, and whose spirits rose with eating as some men's do with drink. He could not help, too, rolling his large eyes around him as he ate, and chuckling with the possibility that he might one day be the lord of all this scene of almost unimaginable luxury and splendor. Then, he thought, oh, how soon he would turn his back upon the old schoolhouse, snap his fingers in the face of Hans von Ripper and every other niggardly patron, and kick any itinerant pedagogue out of doors that should dare to call him comrade. Old Baltus von Tassel moved about amongst his guests with a face dilated with content and good humor, round and jolly as the harvest moon. His hospitable attentions were brief, but expressive, being confined to a shake of the hand and a slap on the shoulder and a loud laugh and a pressing invitation to fall to and help themselves. And now the sound of music from the common room, or hall, summoned to the dance. The musician was an old gray-headed one who had been the itinerant orchestra of the neighborhood for more than half a century. His instrument was as old and as battered as himself. The greater part of the time he scraped on 2 or 3 strings, accompanying every movement of the bow with a motion of the head, bowing almost to the ground and stamping with his foot whenever a fresh couple were to start. Ichabod prided himself upon his dancing as much as upon his vocal powers. Not a limb, not a fibre about him was idle, and to have seen his loosely hung frame in full motion and clattering about the room, you would have thought St. Vitus himself, that blessed patron of the dance, was figuring before you in person. He was all admiration of all those there who, having gathered of all ages and sizes from the farm and the neighborhood, and forming almost a pyramid of shining faces at every door and window, gazing with delight at the scene, rolling their eyeballs and showing rows of teeth from ear to ear. How could the flogger of urchins be otherwise than animated and joyous? The lady of his heart was his partner in the dance, and smiling graciously in reply to all of his amorous oglings, whilst Brom Bones, sorely smitten with both love and jealousy, sat brooding by himself in the corner. When the dance was at an end, Ichabod was attracted to a knot of the sager folks, who, with an old Van Tassel, sat smoking at one end of the piazza, gossiping over former times, and drawing out long stories about the war. Now, this neighborhood, at the time of which I am speaking, was one of those highly favored places which abound with chronicle and with great men. The British and American line had run near it during the war. It had therefore been the scene of marauding and infested with refugees and cowboys and all kinds of border chivalry. Just sufficient time had elapsed to enable each storyteller to dress up his tale with a little becoming fiction, and the indistinctness of his recollection to make himself the hero of every exploit. There was the story of Doffu Martling, a large blue-bearded Dutchman who had nearly taken a British frigate with an old iron 9-pounder from a mud breastwork, only that his gun burst at the 6th discharge. Oh, and there was an old gentleman who shall be nameless, being too rich a mynheer to be lightly mentioned, who in the Battle of White Plains, being an excellent master of defence, parried a musket ball with a small sword, insomuch that he absolutely felt it whiz round the blade and glance off at the hilt, in proof of which he was ready at any time to show the sword, with the hilt a little bit bent. There were several more that had been equally great in the field, not one of whom but was persuaded that he had a considerable hand in bringing the war to a happy termination. But all these were nothing to the tales of ghosts and apparitions that succeeded. The neighborhood is rich in legendary treasures of the kind. Local tales and superstitions thrive best in these sheltered, long-settled retreats, but are trampled underfoot by the shifting throng that forms the population of most of our country places. Besides, there is no encouragement for ghosts in most of our villages, for they have scarcely had time to finish their first nap and turn themselves in their graves before their surviving friends have traveled away from the neighborhood, so that when they turn out at night to walk upon their rounds, they have no acquaintance left to call upon. This is perhaps the reason why we so seldom hear of ghosts, except in our long-established Dutch communities. The immediate cause, however, of the prevalence of supernatural stories in these parts was doubtless owing to the vicinity of Sleepy Hollow. There was a contagion in the very air that blew from that haunted region. It breathed forth an atmosphere of dreams and fancies infecting all the land. Several of Sleepy Hollow's people were present at Van Tassel's, and, as usual, were doling out their wild and wonderful legends. Many dismal tales were told about funeral trains, and mourning cries, and wailings heard and seen about the great tree where the unfortunate Major Andre was taken, and which stood in the neighborhood. Some mention was made also of the woman in white that haunted the dark glen at Raven Rock, and was often heard to shriek on winter nights before a storm, having perished there in the snow. The chief part of the stories, however, turned upon that favorite spectre of Sleepy Hollow, the Headless Horseman, who had been heard several times of late patrolling the country, and it was said, tethered his horse nightly among the graves in the churchyard. But that is where we must pause for this evening. I shall see you again tomorrow.